I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk, where we take a unique view of world events. We report news as history. With me today is the editor of StrategyPage.com and well-known military author, Jim Dunnigan. Associate editor and syndicated columnist Austin Bay also joins us. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Koreans are doing some funny things lately. They have a little sub out there, and they claim they've launched a ballistic missile. Jim, did they really do that?
It's hard to say. I mean, there's evidence that they have a missile. Actually, there's fairly conclusive evidence. It's less certain that they have, a functional sub. What it comes down to is this: last year, 10 months ago, I believe it was, they released a video showing a missile popping out of the water behind Kim Jong-un, the current ruler up there, and it was dismissed as fake because the missile didn't ignite; it just popped out, and that's all you got to see. This time, there was no Kim, but there was the missile popping out and then igniting, and nobody's been able to dismiss the video as photoshopped or faked in any way. But what it also showed was that the missile engines ignited, but then it crashed a few seconds later. It didn't go very far. Now, what we do know before these two events was that the North Koreans bought some R-27 former Russian SLBM, sea-launched ballistic missiles, in the 1990s for scrap. Russia was selling off a lot of Cold War surplus, and since North Korea has always been a favored customer, as it were, of Russia was no longer sending money, as they were up until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but they were willing to sell them, items for scrap for nothing or for very little. It is known that some of the scrap the North Koreans received, it wasn't properly demilitarized, and they refurbished it. Some weapons. Now, it wasn't only the R-27 that they received; they also received 10 Gulf-class missile boats. Which were how should I put it? These were older, and these were diesel electric boats, and they were ancient. Now, what is thought happened was that the North Koreans may have modified one of the Gulfs. And because the missile the Gulf used was not the same as it was not the R-27, if they'd done that, which is technically feasible, they could have gotten the R-27 to work, which is ancient tech, similar to what they've been developed themselves, and so it was theoretically possible. The problem is, normally when you develop a new SLBM, you test it from a shore-based silo first. You don't go through all the bother of sticking it into the water silo. Now, eventually, the next step is to basically do what the Indians did in the last few years, or actually quite recently. You take your SLBM and you put it in a silo which is submerged, with a floating dock or whatever. I mean, there's any number of ways you can do it. And then test it that you can basically release the missile from its just below the surface, submerged silo. It'll pop up the surface. First you do the pop-up test, and then you do the pop-up with ignition, and eventually you test it, to perform as it should as a missile. And at the final stage is to put it in a working SSBM or SSB, that's a non-nuclear ballistic missile submarine, and test it there. The North Koreans are not going through that route, and so it's unclear exactly what they're doing. Now, the other bit of evidence we have is they've been testing a lot of missiles lately, a lot of their ballistic missiles of various ranges, and the South Koreans have been eagerly out there collecting parts. there are some float, some float to shore, and the North Koreans have been unable to stop this. And of course, what the South Koreans are doing is forensics. They've been carefully examining these parts, and what they've concluded is the North Koreans have produced no new missile components since for the last 4 years or at least. And so they're basically recycling old tech. So as usual, nobody's sure what the North Koreans are doing. They're doing something. They have 2 missiles popping out of the water. One of them just went plop. The other one ignited and then plopped. But nobody's seen the submarine. And of course, we're watching like hawks, both with, high flying aircraft and satellites. And of course, there's been no reports from any of the people getting out. Over 1,000 people are still getting out of North Korea every year to South Korea, where they can be debriefed, as it were. There's a lot of cell phones floating around North Korea, and some of those are Chinese, which get up near the border and they can connect to at some risk, because the secret police are up there with detectors, looking for people like that. And so there's still communications. There are also still commercial travelers, Chinese. There are fewer of them now that the Chinese are enforcing the sanctions. But be that as it may, over the last year, there's been no credible reports, either photographic or from witnesses inside North Korea, that a SSB, a diesel-electric ballistic missile submarine, exists, or is even being built for that matter. They could be doing it in a shed somewhere. There are sheds in some of the shipyards where some work goes on, but nobody's seen the mystery SSB, take to the water, assuming it even exists. So there we are. Maybe, who the hell knows?
Austin, what do you think?
Well, I appreciate Jim's very clear description of what is the usual way you go about testing a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Any type of submarine launched missile, even if you're launching an anti-ship missile or a shore strike missile from a torpedo tube. So you go through the non-submarine tests, and underwater, as Jim described it, the pop out of the container, the tube, and then ignition, move to the surface and the like. And that's the fact that they're advertising it as coming out of a submarine, pictures coming out of a submarine, tells me that this is a propaganda message, Dan, and a warning. The Israeli submarine force, when it was first rumor intelligence said that they were carrying cruise missiles with nuclear warheads, was sometimes described, even in the Israeli and in the Western press, as the Samson option, referring to Samson and Delilah, but Samson is captured by the Philistines and he's tortured, blinded, but he tears down a building and kills himself, but kills all the Philistines. In other words, it's telling at the time Arab states at war with Israel that if you come after us, we've got these submarines offshore that you can't deal with, and we're going to strike back. Now, we've talked about this on Strategy Talk before. We write about it all the time. I've written a couple of columns. Jim covers this in and out. The strategic situation for the North Korean regime has steadily deteriorated over the years, but it really began deteriorating in 2010 with that Chonan sinking, where a North Korean mini-sub commando team, that's the way the evidence stacks up, sank a South Korean Navy corvette, killed 46 young sailors, most of them young, and suddenly the sobriety struck a vast a majority of younger Koreans, saying these guys are dangerous, just like our parents were trying to tell us. And that has had political effects in South Korea. South Korea has let China know, and know in certain terms, you better rein these guys in, meaning North Korea. The fact that a South Korean became Secretary General of the UN is not to be fully dismissed. It shouldn't be dismissed either. You've seen South Korea and Japan, despite the enmity that exists between Koreans and the Japanese, South Korea and Japan have made common cause, as they darn well should, against North Korea's nuclear threat. And as Jim's covered this well, you see glimpses of this even back in 2006 with one of the early North Korean nuclear tests. But the Chinese have become much more publicly critical of North Korea. So there's the isolation and strangulation of what at one time was called the Python strategy. That was something that the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, came up with. It was a name applied to it to try to squeeze the nuke out of North Korea. Belatedly, it's having some. You're seeing it happen diplomatically. The deterioration economically in North Korea is evident. So, what does the Kim regime do? Say, look, the Japanese and South Koreans and even the Americans are talking about a preemptive strike or a quick strike on our nuclear delivery facilities. In other words, the ballistic missile launch pads. Attacking the hardened sites in the northern mountain range that we strongly believe they have ballistic missiles, whether they're hidden. If you can't knock them out, you put enough rubble on top of them so they can't roll the missiles out and shoot them or open the silos, and all that could be done. Okay, but that's not going to guarantee Japan, South Korea, the United States, China, everyone else that you've knocked out our nuclear capability. We're going to have a sub out there. And you're not going to be sure about that sub. And that sub is, as Jim said, it's not working yet, but they want to make the statement that they are working to that so that there's, a lurking strike back capability. And that's the way I see it. It is a charade. It's Potemkin at this point. The Israeli capability was not Potemkin, Dan. I mean, it was real, is real. They possess it, but the North Koreans are trying to emulate that. Is the way I see it. So we're seeing propaganda, diplomacy, political action with it. It's not even the failure has utility to them because they get the coverage that they're working on it, and it's has a regime maintenance angle.
Okay. Wow. So, Jim, do you think the Koreans are just going to continue playing these games? I mean, at some point,
North Koreans, Dan.
Well, yeah, the North Koreans. Yeah. The North Koreans are going to continue playing these games. Are they? At some point, don't they just run out of money? The ability to feed their people.
Yes, the UN and foreign aid agencies reported that, from what they're hearing and from what the weather satellites are reporting, the crop this year in North Korea is going to be lower for the first time in years. They've had several good years, at least 6 good years of crops. They've had their ups and downs. They've tried to increase their agricultural production. They haven't been able to that much. But they've lost a lot of their foreign aid, food aid, mainly because they refuse to let distribution be monitored. And that's a big no-no because there is plenty of evidence, they've denied it for years, that North Korea was taking a lot of that aid and selling it, either in China or on the local markets, which meant it wasn't reaching the people who were literally starving to death. So there are very few donor nations willing, including South Korea, which are willing to supply the amount of food they had because they know from past performance that if they don't allow monitors in North Korea, it means they're still stealing the food. So, yes, Kim Jong-un, the government up there, they apparently still believe that they can bluff the world, extort the world, as it were, including China, into giving them the food, allowing them to develop nukes and ICBMs so they can basically threaten people some more. I mean, it's insane. But, you know, he could say the same thing about a lot of, you know, dictators, Saddam Hussein, Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong. I mean, he's considered a hero in China, but he was totally out of it, especially in the 60s. Joe Stalin, the list goes on and on. It defies logic. And diplomats, I think, at least the ones who are on their game, as it were, are aware of that. That some people just will go bonkers on you and are totally unpredictable according to any rules of logic or common sense. And they had one mass starvation already in the 1990s, when as much as 1 million or more people died from starvation. There are more incidents, very few, in the last few years of starvation. Again, these are from witnesses getting out. A lot of people say they're getting out to avoid starvation. You know, nobody's talking about freedom. They want to live. And so you risk your life getting across the border, which is much more heavily guarded these days. But as Austin pointed out, China has lost its patience. China for a long time considered itself, I mean, even before the communists came along, Korea was considered a protectorate of China. Koreans and the Koreans are proud of this, they were too tough, too troublesome to successfully, you know, invade and absorb into China. So the Chinese, as they did with many, you know, neighboring states, said, all right, if you'll pay tribute and just not make a mess for us, we'll leave you alone. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, history is repeating itself. And what they've done in the past is, if it's too much of a problem, and that's where it's headed now, they will either try and stage a coup, which the current regime, Kim Jong-un, is very much afraid of. That's why they've been so many high-level executions lately, since he took power in 2012. And they have said that, you know, nobody can attack North Korea except them, except China. And so China may, you know, they basically feel itself forced to go for a dirty coup, which is basically an invasion with a few pro-China, you know, notables in North Korea, you know, somehow getting a message out, you know, Obi-Wan, save us. Again, that sounds absurd, but, you know, what choice do you have? The Chinese do not want the North Koreans to have nukes, because they've been threatened before by the North Koreans. They've been cheated. I mean, even when China was their main access point for exports, for imports, for smuggling, including illegal things like drugs, the North Koreans would cheat. They would literally. I mean, at one point we reported this. They tried to steal Chinese railroad cars. You know, they'd enter with goods, and then the North Koreans said, "Oh, what's railroad cars? We're talking, you know, dozens." You know, and the Chinese says, "We know where they are. Give them back, or else." And they went back. Oh yeah, we found them. I mean, that sounds, you know, like tragicomic, you know, routines. But this has been repeated again and again and again. And unless the North Koreans have a sudden change of face, and they have basically painted themselves into a corner, because the North Koreans had a reform wing, as it were. They were basically, which the Kims call the pro-China wing. China was saying, look, do what we did. You know, keep it a police state like we did, but allow economic freedom, and then feed off your capitalists. You know, don't let them take over the government. And North Koreans, the hardliners, you know, the Kims basically said, no, we don't trust that to work in Korea. Now they may be right, because the Korean dictatorship has been much more brutal than anything China had to undergo. I mean, the worst part that the Chinese experience was in the 60s. I mean, it was bad in the 50s when the Mao's, newly established communists went around shooting anybody who they thought might resist, but it was not even as bad as Stalin did at his height. But then in the 60s, they tried another revolution, and that killed not just, direct murders, as it were, but there was over 10 million, maybe 20 million, nobody's sure, who starved to death because it disrupted the economy enormously.
That's a cultural revolution.
Cultural revolution, yeah. Well, yeah,
yeah. They also lost 3 million people of the Great Leap Forward, Jim, too. So we're
so anyway, at that point, by the end of the 60s, Mao was quietly, caged, as it were. I mean, he wasn't really deposed, but when he died in the mid-70s, his wife and the gang of her three allies, the gang of four, they tried to replace him, and they shut that down real quick. And next thing you know, the reformers were in charge, and they said, let's try what they're doing now. And of course, now they've become hugely successful. The North Koreans felt, no. They were paying more attention to what happened in Romania, where you had a similar dictatorship, the Ceausescu, dictatorship, where when 1989, when the wall came down and all the communist governments in Eastern Europe fell, the one in Romania didn't quite fall. The secret police came out and shot Ceausescu and all his close, associates. And then they said, oh, we've had a revolution. And the North Korean leadership are afraid, they'll get a Ceausescu, not a Deng Xiaoping, not a economic revolution with the communists still in charge. So they feel that their lives are on the line, and they don't care how many North Koreans die, to keep them going. And the North Koreans, I mean, the one thing the Russians, the Bolsheviks invented was a fairly efficient, police state. And fortunately for the world, they couldn't, create a command economy that could sustain it indefinitely. But the North Koreans feel that they have nothing to lose, so they're basically willing to kill as many North Koreans as it takes to try and bully their neighbors and especially China into letting them just keep on going. And the rest of the world, including China, is not cooperating. The Chinese have told them, look, you can starve. And if you get violent with China, then you will die. I don't know exactly how that was worded, but from what I gathered, those messages have been delivered, and the North Koreans, sort of didn't blink. So there it stands. I mean, it's going to go down in history as one of those very bizarre situations, but unfortunately, history is littered with them.
Let me add a couple of things to that. I think Jim showed how, I'm sorry, North Korea is not an immovable object, and in comparison, China is an unstoppable force, and it's not just China. I've heard, obviously, Jim's the guy I got this from, that China had said, if somebody's going to take action, it's going to be us. But the thing is, the United States, Japan, South Korea say that's fine. You're the ones who propped them up for so long. You're the ones who sustained this problem and at times encouraged it. You see, I'm making it sound like a discussion in a saloon, but that to some degree that for the South Korea, Japan, the U.S., it is telling China, you're the one who's let them hang on this long. Russia to some degree, but the promotion, and you got something out of it because it was a way to rattle South Korea, the U.S., and the like. Things have changed. The strategic calculus changed quite a while ago, and you're just starting to catch up. And, under, sub rosa, sotto voce, the Chinese are acknowledging that. I think Jim's description of some of the Chinese options are quite accurate. I could actually come up with some scenarios, credible scenarios, I think, where you see some combined action with South Korea and the U.S. and certainly with supplying intelligence to take out some of the North Korean special weapons capabilities. I realize this is speculation, Dan, but these are the things that go on in operations and plans cells in all the capitals of of the world when you're presented with a problem like North Korea. One other thing, though, that I think I want to raise here, since we started off talking about a sub-launch ballistic missile and the ballistic missiles, is that it has, I think it's been a lesson to the United States. The Japanese, and I'm saying a lesson in the need to have anti-missile, anti-ballistic missile, anti-missile defense systems at a theater and strategic level. The Japanese were very clever politically about this, but they came to that conclusion, Dan, in the mid-'80s. And you see that when they start building their Congo-class destroyers, which we say that they're Aegis capable. Well, they were capable of having the radars and also the magazines to handle the standard line of U.S. Navy standard missiles that had anti-ballistic missile capability. And the idea when they actually started funding these things in 1988 was that they would be able to integrate and operate with U.S. forces and provide some thin shield, as it was termed, thin shield ballistic missile defense. That got so little coverage because if you'll recall at the time, that was also about 1990, you had some hotheads here in the U.S. and in Japan talking about the Japan that can go it alone, will go it alone, or even some weirdos talking about a looming U.S.-Japanese war. It was totally ridiculous if you looked at the long lead time and what the Japanese had concluded both about North Korea and China. Well, that has spread. The cooperation on anti-missile defense between the United States and Japan has continued, despite the bitter opposition by certain groups here in the United States against ballistic missile defense. We still see it, and yet, let's see, I think, 10 days ago, I believe President Obama had a interview where he said that he informed the interviewer that we were positioning our missile defenses in the Pacific region to account for the North Korean threat. Well, gee, aren't we glad we have them? And we certainly don't. It's not impermeable, but it is layered. We have shorter range, middle range, and then some longer range systems. In my view, we're short on these, what are now called, mid-course interceptors. They used to be called GBI, ground-based interceptors. They're essentially interceptors you can hit, and if we're in space, it's like putting an ABM on an ICBM, and we've got a couple of fields out west, one in Alaska and the other one in California with those. Those are the long-range interceptors. But the Navy's got numerous now cruisers and Aegis destroyers that can handle standard missiles and some upgraded standard missiles that have real efficacy against IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles. Army's got its THAAD, which used to be called Theater High Altitude Air Defense System. Now it's Terminal, I think, is the name for it. Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. And South Korea has asked for, and I believe is going to receive, the decision may have been made recently, I know there was a discussion about it, a THAAD battery that's probably going to be put down in right on the southern coast, maybe around Busan, to counter a North Korean intermediate range ballistic missile shot. It complements the Patriot PAC-3s, which are short-range anti-ballistic missiles. We have it. It doesn't guarantee stopping a volley of North Korean missiles, but it puts doubt, just like when I said that the North Korean regime, I think, is trying to trot their sub-missile out to introduce doubt into the minds of the Japanese, South Koreans, Chinese, and Americans that strike on our part to knock out their nukes wouldn't guarantee that they wouldn't strike back. Well, the anti-ballistic missile shield, the thin shield that already exists and is already there in East Asia, northern East Asia, puts legitimate doubt in the minds of the North Koreans. There's talk of putting, it's close to being approved, of something called Aegis Ashore, essentially the Navy standard missiles in Hawaii. There is a THAAD battery already at Guam, and the Aegis Ashore, just for what it's worth, some of those systems are going to go into Eastern Europe well, you're not supposed to say it, but then knock down a shot from the southeast. It's not against Russians. I guess it could be, but it's really aimed at Iran, even though, as we've talked about that before, the Iranian threat's supposedly solved. Right, Dan? It's not.
Right, yeah.
Anyway, my point is that the North Korea's provocative actions actually it strikes me that one of the benefits out of it is suddenly everybody realizes that, yeah, they're expensive. No, they're not perfect, but the ballistic missile defense systems have utility. The Japanese think so. South Koreans think so. And there are plenty of people in the U.S. Armed Forces that know so. And so it's a spin-off of having a persistent threat. I think that the Chinese understand that as well.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it at that. We always come back to our North Korean friends eventually.
Our friends.
So, well, it's sort of like the world's crazy uncle, I guess. But
I don't know.
There's nukes in the garage. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, but look. I know we're hanging up on it, but Jim's description of what they've done to their own people is just, you look at that. Look at over the years, look how many own people have they just starved to death?
Right.
It's criminals. So they're just total criminals.
Yeah. It's your crazy uncle that beats his wife. So, I mean, it's just, yeah, it is horrible.
And kills your cousins,
And kills your cousins, yeah.
It's got them locked up in the basement.
Right. They are. All right.
All right. Well, we will talk to you next time.
Bye, guys.
We'll see you.